Hi there, everyone. Hi there, everyone. I am Sanya Kuller, and in this video, I want to talk to you guys about an interview that I did with Lily and Jasmine Ackman. I did an interview with them, and they are identical twins. So who I had met, and asking them a bunch of questions, basically, because it is extremely interesting to learn about identical twins. They have 100% of the same exact DNA. So they are pretty much clones of each other. And identical twin studies are just so important. Twin studies are conducted on identical or fraternal twins, that's what they're called. And they try to help us understand environmental or genetic influences for traits, phenotypes, disorders. How can identical twins differ from each other? So since they have 100% of the DNA, they have the same exact nature biologically. So everything is the same, the genetic code is exactly the same, but identical twins may not always be the same in terms of personality or other aspects about them. And that's why researchers are super fascinated. Like, even if you have the same DNA, why are you different from each other? And these identical twin studies can help us understand how the environment, how nurture can play a role in certain phenotypes that are observed between identical twins. So studies using them are so useful. Is it the environment, like how each of their experiences, for instance, between Jasmine or Lily, or is it their genetic information, their DNA that can make them who they are? So this is a sister-sister moment. So if we study identical twins, these results can better determine whether a certain trait that we observe, an illness, a disorder, is it influenced more heavily by genetics or by the environment? And the key word that we see here is epigenetics. How does epigenetics influence our health? So I'll explain what epigenetics is exactly, but this is a great example of research in the medical and biomedical field. So twins can teach us a lot about nature versus nurture. So, you have identical twins, and what are the differences between them? So we can see one of my favorite shows is Sister Sister. It's really great here. So, it's about two twins. They were separated from birth, and they didn't know it, and they were adopted. It's a TV show, and then they realize and they find each other in a shopping mall. So it's a really interesting show. You can learn a lot about nature versus nurture. So that's exactly it. And it's important for a lot of different questions on mental health, orientation, diseases. So yeah, if you look up nature versus nurture, this is what you'll see. It's a pre-wiring, that's what nature is. It's our genetic inheritance, other biological factors, or DNA. Nurture is generally the influence of other factors, like exposure, life experiences, learning, the people we've been surrounded with. So that's what all these research studies are trying to do. Nature versus nurture. The genetics and all the factors that are inherited. And the nature of the individual plays a big role. And nurture are an environment, things you get from the world after you are born. It shapes our character. For instance, in nature versus nurture studies, what we could observe are, I think it's taking a while to load up here, but this is all an epigenetics, basically, nature versus our nurture. So you might be wondering, well, what is epigenetics? Epigenetics is a study of how your behaviors and your environment can lead to changes in your way that your genes work. So, the expression of our genes, essentially. So you can have the same exact DNA sequence, which is 100% identical between identical twins. It's exactly the same between them. But we notice differences between them. If one identical twin has a certain condition, the other may or may not develop it sometimes. And like genetic changes, epigenetic changes are reversible and do not change your DNA sequence, but they can change how your body reads a DNA sequence. So you can have the same DNA, but the way that your body will be working and interpreting and those genes will be different. So there are many different ways that there can be gene regulation. So if we look here in epigenetics, we can see that our DNA is packaged really tightly into 23 pairs of chromosomes, one from each of our parents. And so if we look at one of these chromosomes and we take it apart, we'll see that it's composed of chromatin, that's DNA, and it's tightly wound around these histone proteins. And when it's really wound around, I like to think of it like yarn. When it's wound around like yarn, it becomes very inaccessible. So the gene could be inactive. So for instance, if you think of this, DNA being wrapped around the proteins like a tiny ball of yarn. So wherever it's in this yarn, it's very inaccessible. We can't really access it too well. It's stuck. But the regions that are open, the euchromatin is what we can access. So that's the region of the DNA that is open, and all these factors can access it, which is really important. So epigenetic, could be impacted by our development, environmental chemicals, drug, aging, diet, essentially. So basically, you have the same DNA in identical twins, but how that DNA is accessed may differ. It could be open or closed based on environmental factors, which are epigenetic factors, So these are called histone modifications. These are the histone proteins, the proteins around which DNA can wind to be compact and help regulate the expression of genes. And genes, can lead us to proteins, and proteins make up like who we are. They perform so many functions in our body. So DNA methylation, a methyl group, or an epigenetic factor found in some dietary sources can tag DNA and activate or repress genes. So you may have the same exact DNA sequence, but how that sequence, if it's able to be accessed, so if that sequence is wound around these proteins, it can't be accessed. The twins may have the same exact DNA, but it's so difficult to access that genetic information because that DNA is wound around the proteins. It's almost like that information can't be accessed. It's like hidden from access. It's there. They have the same DNA, the same code, the same letter-based sequences, the same exact sequence of ATGCs in the body. They have the same exact, like the DNA is composed of, this adenine, thymine, guanine, uracil, the same set of sequences along all, 46 chromosomes in healthy individuals. That's what they have, the same information in all these chromosomes in their cell, in the nucleus of their cells. But what makes them different is that whether or not certain genes can be expressed, or if they're wound around these proteins. So these are factors, like these are modifications to whether or not the DNA can be accessed by these transcription factors and other things. So that's what epigenetics is. How does your environment and all these little chemical tags that are added onto the DNA that can impact whether it's wound tightly into hidden chromatin? That's what this is called. That's when it's wound tightly in a tight ball and you can't really access it. Like in my knitting, for instance, this tight ball. Or when it's open and you can read it, like you can actually read this DNA, the DNA is accessible, the gene is active. That is euchromatin. So those patterns may be different between the identical twins. And our lifestyle can really differentiate between that. So there are all these genes out there, even for like major depression, for instance. For a long time, doctors have known that depression runs in families. So many individuals with depression can have other family members who also have struggled with the same or similar illness. So early studies on the genetics of depression were conducted with twins. So identical twins can share the same genes, while fraternal and non-twin siblings share only 50% of their genetic material. So everybody else besides identical twins, they only share, everybody else, meaning siblings, share only 50%, but identical twins have the same gene, same genetic information. So when one identical twin is depressed, the other twin will also have depression 76% of the time. So if you're an identical twin, your risk of depression is, it's increased. So if your twin has it, an identical twin, then, the 76% chance of also having depression as well. So there's a 24% chance that you won't have depression. So that 24% could be explained by other factors out there. So it may not always be genes, right? But there could be other things like your environmental stresses that can impact it. So we're trying to figure out, using identical twins, are there certain conditions or diseases where if one twin has it, the other one is probably going to have it? If not, where are there differences? So talking to twins is so important to figure these questions out, but not just depression, but other causes. So to better explain epigenetics and how does it relate to child development. So epigenetics is an emerging area of scientific research that shows how environmental influences, children's experiences, actually affects the expression of their genes. So genes are set in stone. It's not necessarily true. So it's almost always both. You may have the genetic code, but if you have a bad diet or you're always stressed or the environment in which you are raised, that could really impact certain aspects about you. So this is something that was really interesting to me. There was this really, this is in Bogota, Colombia. My folks have been there. It's a really beautiful place. And basically, a few years ago, I saw this article on, you can imagine that you have these identical twins. Let me just say you have, this identical twin and this identical twin here. And then you have this and this, and you can imagine a switch up happening in the hospital where these two land up together and these two land up together. And then they discover each other through mutual friends. It's a really interesting story. So the mixed up brothers of Bogota in Colombia. So, so imagine like, these two were brothers, identical, they are brothers, identical twins. So these are the two stars and these are the two hearts. So by accident, like, these two land up together and these two land up together. And so it's a huge confusion that has taken place. So it's a very interesting story. Brotherly love, Colombian twins, who are switched, they pull together. The story could well be the plot of a Latin American soap opera, a telenovela, a Colombian one to be more precise. So they were in Colombia in South America. So two pairs of identical twins who were mixed up soon after they were born in 1988 and grew up apart find each other 25 years later through a combination of chance events. It made headlines, when the New York Times published a long and comprehensive article about it. So you can probably see, you could probably tell them apart, or maybe not. See, these two are twins. One is wearing glasses, the other one's not. They have had vastly different life experiences. So they could not believe how similar they were, and they had the same skinny body, narrow face, small mouth, and cheeky smile, even after being separated. So a butcher identified that, hey, you look very similar to somebody else. It took a butcher and it took a photo and showed it to Jorge, who was dumbstruck. They bore a striking resemblance. So when I met them, they both had very similar white mobile phones, which they said they had bought separately. They were both born here. All four were born prematurely at 7 months. They had the same tendency to play with their phones. So we're going to see similarities between these identical twins who were separated and grew up in very different life experiences. So that's so fascinating. Twins as a window into nature versus nurture, what twins can tell us about who we are. So it's a very fascinating story. So during development, DNA makes up our genes. It has chemical marks that determine how much or little of the gene is expressed. So this expression of chemical marks is the epigenome. And the different experiences children have rearrange those chemical marks. So this explains why genetically identical twins can exhibit different behaviors, skills, health, and achievement. So epigenetics explains how early experiences can have lifelong impacts. So the genes that children inherit from their biological parents gives us information that guides their development, like how tall they could be or the kind of temperament that they have. So when experiences during development rearrange epigenetic marks that help with gene expression, whether the gene is accessible or not to be transcribed into messenger RNA, and then that into a polypeptide that can form proteins, and then those can be expressed, right? So these epigenetic marks can impact even if you have the same exact DNA sequence, which is only among identical twins. The fact is epigenetics can impact if certain genes are expressed in one twin versus the other. So it can be affected by positive experiences, such as supportive relationships and opportunities for learning, or negative influences like environmental toxins or stressful life circumstances. And then these can leave a unique epigenetic signature on the gene. So they leave these chemical tags, these markers, and then that can affect if the DNA is wound around tightly or if it's accessible or not. So these signatures can be temporary or permanent, and both types affect how easily the genes are switched on or off. It's sort of like it helps guide whether or not the genes will be accessed or not. Are they wound tightly or are they not wound tightly? Is the DNA wound tightly or not? Will other factors come there to make it into a messenger RNA and then a protein or not? So recent research demonstrates that there may be ways to reverse certain negative changes and restore healthy functioning. But the very best strategy is to support responsive relationships and reduce stress and build strong brains from the beginning. So your environment can really shape you for who you are. If you grow up in a stressful place, or if you grow up in a place where people are very relaxed and happy-going. So that it all depends. That's how nurture can shape you. Experiences that very early in life, when the brain is developing most rapidly, cause epigenetic adaptations that influence whether, when, and how genes release their instructions for building future capacity for health, skills, and resilience. So that's why it's crucial to provide supportive and nurturing experiences for young children in the earliest years. So high quality healthcare. So it's so important. So we had this Zoom interview. And I basically was talking with Lily and Jasmine about their experiences and what sets them apart. So we just had this Zoom interview, and I wanted to basically show you. I had a bunch of questions that I was trying to ask them about, the information about their tastes and personalities and interests and strengths and weaknesses, and see how much of it do they have. So it's a pretty comprehensive list of questions, and I was really thankful for their time and insights. And there's just a sample statistic of one, but this is an interesting interview into identical twins to figure out, and what hope you guys will observe from this is that, you know, same exact DNA, different interests, different personality types as well. A lot of things in common, but there's certain things that are different in terms of what they want to do. You know, certain core things may be the same, but some differences also exist that is brought up by the nurture, by the environment as well. And this was just an insight that I had. And I just want to show you that you can have the same exact DNA, but your environment can really, really shape you. So I hope that you will enjoy the interview that I had with them. And I'm really thankful to them, to Lily and Jasmine, for their time in answering our questions. And I really hope that you will also enjoy it as much as I do.